I'd like to introduce myself, Steve Norton, and my colleague Scott Pecnik of the Planit DevOps team. So first I'd like to spend a couple of minutes with some background information on Planit and Planit DevOps, and then we'll get directly into the demo. So Planit, we've been a leader in quality assurance solutions for more than 20 years, with a workforce of more than 1,200 full-time employees and a global reputation for excellence. We provide customers with best-in-class consultancy in every phase of software product delivery. Our DevOps practice and the specialist team was built on that heritage in training, testing, and innovative technical solutions, including our renowned process optimization programs. And so as we move through the demo, and if you feel you'd like to know more about the where, the why, and the how to start on a DevOps journey, we've included reference information at the end. And of course, our DevOps practice already supports customer implementations across the IT value chain. I think we all recognize there are a lot of DevOps definitions in the industry. From a Planit view of the DevOps landscape, the definition should be simple and it should be clear. DevOps is a set of practices encompassing automation, cultural transformation, and process improvement that defines and supports how to build and deliver better quality software faster. So DevOps is a set of practices. It is not product-centric. It is not a specification, an architecture, or a methodology. And we know that every enterprise seeks continuous improvement, and DevOps enables continuous improvement goals. For example, realizing daily or weekly deployment schedules instead of monthly or quarterly, while improving quality and security and realizing higher business value. And no DevOps journey is the same. Companies like Google or Uber deliver and deploy hundreds or thousands of code features and changes every day. By contrast, Planit customers such as banks, insurance companies, telco, utilities, and government institutions may be deploying monthly or quarterly. However, both types of organizations may well be employing DevOps practices to realize their specific target business objectives. And finally, we should remember DevOps is relatively new. The movement began in 2009. By comparison, the Agile Manifesto was published in 2001. And Agile methods have been adopted by most of Planit customers and across the industry. And similarly, we believe that in the next 1 to 2 years, DevOps adoption will be as widespread. At Planit, we identify 6 key segments to a successful DevOps journey. And because every customer is unique with different objectives and pain points, not every aspect of that journey may apply. So for this DevOps Toolchain demo, we're going to focus on the 4 highlighted segments of core DevOps areas. So let's get to the demo right now. Scott, can you take it away, please?
All right, thank you, Mr. Norton. I'll just give a little bit of background on what I'm going to show and why I'm going to show it. So, like Steve said, DevOps adoption requires 3 things, and I think it's important, so I'll restate it. It requires process change, it requires cultural transformation, and it requires tool automation. You can't have DevOps without all 3. And the reason why we lead with a product demo is I think, for me as a former developer and having implemented DevOps with, at customer sites for almost 4 years now, it is a tangible way to show what it is a possible end goal is. And if we lead with something that we can all see, then we can kind of come up above and talk about people and process and what it actually takes to successfully implement some of the automation that I'm about to show. So before I actually get into the products, I want to talk about what I'm going to show and give a little bit of background on the tools I'm going to use. So for the planning and definition phase, I'm going to use Jira. The reason why is because it's, at this point, pervasive throughout the industry. I haven't been to a customer in the past 1.5 years that hasn't been using Jira. But that's not to mean that you have to use Jira. If you're adopting DevOps practices, there's IBM Rational Team Concert, there's Rally, and if you're a small team that's sitting around a table and has a whiteboard behind you, it could be okay to use spreadsheets as your planning and definition tool. When we talk about tool automation within the context of DevOps, and what tools you should use, it is always about picking the right tools for you. So what I'm showing here are the right tools for me. They're my fit for purpose for my demonstration, but you may have different tools. You may have tools in-house, and you may have different requirements that requires you to select different tools. From a development perspective, I'm using GitLab, a lot of the same reasons. It's fairly pervasive throughout the industry. We run into it at a lot of clients, but you could be using SVN, CVS, ClearCase, Mercurial. Even in the mainframe world, people are using Endeavor and ChangeMan and things like that. From the CI side, I'm using Jenkins. Again, Jenkins is pretty much pervasive throughout the industry. It's open source. I've run into it at pretty much every client in the past 2 years. But there are other tools. There is Atlassian's Bamboo. There's UrbanCode Build. There is GoCD and things like Circle CI and the DevOps pipelines that are in Amazon AWS and IBM Bluemix. So there's lots of different choices out there. I'm showing the tools that I like for my demonstration. And as part of my CI, I'm actually calling out to JUnit to perform some unit and integration tests. And finally, for my continuous deployment, I'm using IBM UrbanCode Deploy. It's my fit-for-purpose tool for my demonstration. It perfectly shows and demonstrates the message that I want to get across for what it requires and what practices you should follow in implementing continuous deployment. And some of those practices are having the same deployment process that runs from dev all the way through to prod, having the same deployable artifact that runs from dev all the way through to prod, and so on. And as part of my deployment processes, I'm calling out to Selenium, just running some headless system tests. So what I'm going to show is an end-to-end DevOps product automation demo from requirement all the way through to deployment. And it's fairly simple, fairly basic. The point of that is that it's not about what I'm showing, it's about DevOps. It's about the automation, it's about the traceability between the tools, and the application I'm using is simple on purpose, and then we'll kind of come above that and talk about people and process and what it requires to actually make this happen. So with that, I'll actually jump into the demo. So what I'm showing here is an agile storyboard within Jira. I've got a backlog here, and I'm actually in the middle of planning for my sprint or my iteration. One key thing that's very important to note is that in a DevOps world, when we're doing our planning for our iteration, it's not just the capacity of the development team that we're planning for. We're planning for the capacity of the entire organization, of all the stakeholders. So it's, do the developers have the capacity to implement the new features and fix the defects? Do the testers have the capacity to write the code that will test that code? Do the BAs have the capacity to make sure the requirements are met? And do the operations people have the capacity to ensure that they can actually deploy any new features or defects that we build? And in a DevOps world, if we have effective tools, the one thing that we get is traceability and visibility. So going back to DevOps being about people, process, and tools, the tools are the enabler. It is what allows us to collaborate. It's what allows us to break down silos and work together as one cohesive unit instead of a group of testers and a group of developers and an operations team. And because I have tools, I have metrics, and I can work off of metrics and use that to enable my continuous improvement. So in this case here, I'm looking at my last iteration. The team, all the stakeholders, not just the developers, again, the testers, the BAs, and the operations guys, they planned for 18 story points. And so I'm kind of just assuming that you're aware of Agile methods. I think, like we said, Agile's been around for such a long time. Everybody's at least having some implementation of Agile within their organization. So the team planned for 18 story points. And you can see that they had a fairly consistent progression. But at the end of the iteration, they dropped off 2 points. So they were actually only able to complete 16 points. So we can use these metrics within the tool to actually help us get better at planning, which in our world, in the DevOps world, we believe that planning and definition sets the tone. If we can't plan for what we're going to deliver and actually meet that delivery, then we can't get the trust of our clients, of the marketplace. So knowing that we believe our capacity is about 16 points, we'll come back and actually go through and do our planning. So first, I've kind of started to do the planning here, and I'll finish it. So I've got one item here that is 3 points. I've got the second item that is 5 points. The third, another 5 points. And finally 2 points. That brings me to 15 points. Well, I know that my capacity is 16, so I've got one more item. And another thing to note here is that in this world, I've got a properly groomed backlog, which means that the business has gone through and they've ordered their requirements in order of value to them. So they've typed in the requirements, they put them into the tool, and then they've actually put them in order of what they want to be delivered. And then us as the development team, the testers, the operations team, we've gone through and we've put what we believe is our effort on them, and we've weighted them within story points. So far, the priority next that the business would have is this JPET-4. However, it's 5 story points. So far, I planned 15. I know my capacity is 16. So that would put me at 20 points, and that's not something we want to take on. In an agile world, we don't want to start something that we can't complete. We don't want to go through having to back out code. We don't want to have to retest all of our applications because we pulled something out. So this is where it's important to have that process and that open communication and the collaboration from everybody. What I would do is I would go back to the development team and say, look, we can't get this, your next most important item completed. However, the next item on your list of value, we can complete. We know based on the metrics that our capacity is 16 points. We can get this one done. So would you like us to, work on a portion of one item and not complete it, or get your next most important item complete and delivered and in production? And obviously the answer should be, okay, well, we'll reorder what is important to us, and you should work on the next item. And that's what we would do. So then I would take that item, and in the DevOps world, I would plan it. And again, the entire team has collaborated. We planned together. And this is the collaboration and the plan for this particular sprint where everybody's approved and agrees. So beyond the planning is GitLab. And that is, again, just our version control system. There's a lot of other tools out there, but this is where the developers collaborate. This is where they check in and check out code. This is where they handle merge conflicts. This is where we branch for releases and we branch for features. And it's important to note that there is no magical branching strategy or no magical version control system that's going to solve inadequate process. So these tools are enablers again, and they're here to allow us to be more efficient and to collaborate. But if you've got an inadequate process, a tool is not going to fix that for you. So I'm not going to go too much into GitLab at the moment. I'm going to come back to it when I'm actually making code changes, and we'll actually show you pushing code in and seeing that through the process. The next tool in my pipeline is Jenkins, and Jenkins is our CI tool. So just to give some background, Jenkins is essentially a Java application. It sits out on a box, and it's waiting for requests. In my case, I've got the requests that are going to come from GitLab, come from our version control system. So when developers check in code, it's going to ping Jenkins and say, hey, I've got some new code changes. I'd like for you to compile these. And then Jenkins is going to go look in its list of workers, or slaves as they're called, and say, hey, I've got a job for you. Can you complete this? So part of a job would be to first check out the code from the repository, because it has to grab the code. Then it will kick off a build to compile the code. It'll usually kick off some tests to do a quick smoke test, whether they're unit tests or integration tests. And then finally, it will push those deployable artifacts to our deployment tool. And you can actually deploy from Jenkins. I'm doing it from UrbanCode. From my perspective, it's a better fit for purpose tool. But the CI tool is handling all that automation work in the middle ground. So you can see here on my build results, I can see the actual deployable artifact that's created. It's a WAR file. In a more realistic environment, I'd push this to a binary repository store like Nexus or Artifactory. I can see the test result trend, so I can see when somebody delivers code that breaks an automated test, and it looks like so far everything looks good. And then I can also see the build history. So we had some failures last week, but everything looks good so far. So our CI tool is handling all that automation in the middle. And finally, what will happen is that code of the deployable artifacts will get pushed all the way through to our CD tool, where we'll actually handle the deployment. So UrbanCode, just to give a quick background, it's an IBM tool. It's a great tool for deployments, and the way it works here is I define my environments. I associate the actual endpoint. So whether they're containers or they are VMs, I'll associate those, and that's where the actual work will be done. Okay. So what I had done is I'd clicked on a particular environment. Let me just wait for the screen to paint. And then you can see actually how I'm mapping physical resources to environments. So how I'm directing the work to, like I said, could be physical boxes, they could be VMs, what have you. And then as part of my deployment processes, I have everything defined as a parameterized step. So it's the same exact deployment process that runs in dev, runs in production. So you know that by the time you get to prod, your application, your deployable artifact, it's deployed in dev, it's deployed in int countless times, it's deployed in QA. By the time you get to prod, you should have confidence. You have confidence, you expect it to succeed because it's deployed in that particular way over and over and over again using the same method. And it extends through to product configuration as well. So if you're using text files that are pointing to different LDAPs or different databases, all of that stuff should be generic in your deployable artifacts, and as your deployment tool actually goes through and deploys, it should swap in the correct values. That's important. We want to have one deployable artifact, and we want to drive the environment-specific configuration through our deployment tool. We want to make sure there's no issues where, since developers typically have access to development environments, maybe they make a change. They change a JVM parameter or something like that. Well, if we're driving all that type of configuration and that traceability through our deployment tool, we should catch it in int. And maybe we don't catch it in int because it's a performance-related change. Well, we should catch it in QA. By the time we get to prod, we should have caught everything. We should have confidence. We should expect it to succeed. So that's just a quick overview of my toolchain. Let me show you my demonstration, and then I'll actually change some code, and I'll show you some bits and bytes moving around, and we'll see this toolchain in action. So I'm using the old school, original Java Enterprise Edition, the J2EE, back when it was called that, Java Pet Store example. It's simple and basic. It's got all the components I want. It's got static content. It has database. It has an application layer, which you saw is a WAR file. So I want to demonstrate orchestrating a deployment. And what I'll do is I'll go into my dogs here, click on my golden retriever, and you'll see when the screen paints that we've got a defect. So if I go into my store and I see my dog, I've got a pit bull, but that's not a golden retriever. So as a developer or as a tester, I would create a defect, and then the developer would get assigned that defect, and he would go through and he would resolve the issue. So let's actually walk through that entire process end to end. So we'll come back into Jira. And then I will click Create here because I'm going to create a new bug. And I'll just write a quick description and just say the picture next to the retriever is incorrect. And then we'll click Create. So we've got a defect now that's been created in our backlog, and since we're still in the planning phase for our iteration, we'll throw that in. And And then we'll actually go and we'll change our code. So now the testers created the defect. The team has agreed that they can fit it into the context of the iteration. It's been planned. Now it's time for the developer to take ownership and actually make the code change. So I'm going to open up Eclipse. And I know it's just a basic application, and when I deploy it, it actually automatically loads the database. So I'm going to go ahead and change the load script. And let's just take a look here. Dog4. So Dog4 is our golden retriever. So I know that's correct. And then what I'll do as a developer is I'll check that code in. So I'm using Git Bash. It's kind of super nerdy, but it's my fit for purpose tool. So one of the things in the DevOps world is we try and standardize across the tool set for all of our developers so that you know, we have tools that are supported by the organization, and if somebody moves from one org to the other, you don't have to learn new tools. But when it comes to developers, it's always kind of, you know, par for the course to let developers do their thing. Developers are developers, and let them develop. If they want to use Eclipse, let them use Eclipse. If they want to use Notepad or whatever, let them do that. I'm using Git Bash. I've run a quick Git command called git status, and I see that I've got a changed file. So what I'll do next is I will stage that file. And if I run git status again, I'll see that that has been staged. And then the next thing I'll do is I will commit that change. And it's important here, this is where I'm actually going to establish traceability amongst the tools. So I'm going to write a little comment here in my commit and just say change pick of retriever. And then I'm going to type the Jira issue ID, which is JPET-29, because I want to actually link up my commit to the issue that the tester created and then assign to me as the developer. So I will commit that change, and then I will push it to our repository. All right, so it's been pushed. And now if I go back to Jira, we'll take a look at that particular issue. Okay, click on the issue. You can see that our traceability has been created immediately. Let me wait for it to paint for you guys. Here I've got a link to my actual code commit in GitLab. And if I click on that commit, it'll take me to GitLab, where I can actually see the line of code that I changed. And this is open for everybody that has access to GitLab. You can change ACL so that you've got members, you've got reporters, you've got developers, and so on. So I can see the tester himself can see traceability through to a code commit associated with that particular change. If I come to Jenkins, I'll see that automatically as a build is begun and is running. So in the bottom left corner, you can see the build that's running. So it's compiling the code, it's running my unit tests, and then it's pushing the deployable artifact to UrbanCode. If we go to UrbanCode, you'll see that the deployment has already completed. So in addition to compiling the code and pushing to UrbanCode, it actually asked UrbanCode to go and do a deployment. And we'll take a look at the deployment result. So here you can see a deployment to dev happen at 11:57 a.m. If we click on the request, you can actually drill down. You can see logs within each task. So no more emailing back and forth when there's a deployment issue in prod and operations is up on Friday night and they're asking, you know, the developers, what do you think happened here? And we're emailing logs back and forth. Everything is out in the open. There's traceability. And then if we go back to our application and we do a quick refresh, we'll see that the defect has been changed, and now we've got our correct Chihuahua picture. So that's just a quick, very basic DevOps demonstration. So we started with a requirement, we did some planning, everybody was involved in the planning, we talked about our tools, a tester was doing some testing, found an issue, opened a defect, assigned it to an iteration, it got assigned to a developer, the developer made a code change, associated his code change back to the defect, and then we watched it automatically go all the way through the process. The code was compiled, it was deployed. It's important to note that this is a very basic demonstration, but it's just to talk about what things should look like in a DevOps world from an automation perspective. Obviously, we're not going to deploy beyond dev or even int automatically. You know, there's got to be checks and balances in place. There has to be approvals. We're not going to deploy to QA. We're not going to deploy to prod. And in my example, it's very basic, but what we would have is different pipelines probably created in Jenkins, and we'd have deployments to upper environments. We'd have access restrictions, and you'd have those tied to different business cases and so on. Another thing to note is deploying is a business decision. So you may hear when you go to conferences or seminars or other webinars that, you know, people like Uber and Google deploy hundreds, 200 times a day. But just because you're only maybe deploying once a week or once a month doesn't mean you're not following DevOps practices. Deploying is a business decision. If you're a bank or a government organization, it doesn't make sense for you to deploy 100 times a day like Facebook. You deploy on Friday nights, and that's how it's going to stay, and that's all right. But if you have the tool automation in place and you have the process and cultural change where there's an expectation of success, an expectation of everybody working together and marching towards the same goal, then that is what DevOps is all about. So, Steve, I think I'll turn it back over to you. I think you've got a couple slides to close it out, and then we can open up for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So let's, first of all, thanks for that very nerdy demo right there. You developers are something else. But the overall context of the visibility and traceability that's required throughout the software development lifecycle is as critical for a single line item change as it is for complex architectures and systems integration that's required in the testing process. So thank you for that, Scott. We're not going to take the full hour here. We are going to run through a couple of questions. What I want to do is get to this part where we discussed the earlier question as to the why, the where, and the how to start. These questions are quite often asked to Planit's teams, so we're going to kind of give you some brief information right here. We'll recall that DevOps success demands the right processes and culture to support, which is supported by tool automation. You've seen the tool automation piece today. Some companies are already on a DevOps journey, others are evaluating, while some are seeking a course correction. So Planit, as I mentioned, some of our process optimization programs, we have a Planit DevOps process optimization program. It helps our customers answer those how, why, and where to start. It's a high-value program, it's very fast. It assesses your DevOps maturity and capabilities, areas that need change or improvement, and your toolchain effectiveness. And the objective from that maturity assessment is to map out an outcome-based path and the priorities that are required to achieve a target state, essentially a roadmap for a successful DevOps journey. We're not going to get into that. For more information, feel free to explore Planit's website or just log on to planitdevops.com. So we've been compiling questions. There are a few questions which I'd like to bring up, and then we'll just spend 5 minutes on that, and then we'll move forward. So this one is, I'll allow Scott to answer. The first one is, what cultural changes are required for DevOps, or will tools lead the process? Scott?
I think that it's a common misconception that tools are the answer. And a lot of times in what I've seen actually being on the ground is that tools are at the forefront, and tools are sort of set to answer all the world's problems, when kind of like going back to my presentation, like I said, there is no branching strategy, there is no process that can fix, or there is no tool that can fix an inadequate process. So, you know, it's important that we break down silos. It's important that we have tools that enable collaboration and visibility, and it's important that everybody's on board and we're all all working towards the same goal. And that's, I think, the high-level pieces that are required.
Yeah, thanks. That's what I would absolutely agree. Second one, some tools are better suited to support specific technologies and platforms, for example, mainframe or mobile. Does the DevOps path support different tools in the same phase of a life cycle, or do we need common tools, regardless of the platform and technology?
Yeah, so like I said in the presentation, it's all about fit-for-purpose tools. I mean, for my demonstration, the fit-for-purpose was the tools I showed, just because it gets across the message that I wanted to get across. You mentioned mainframe applications, and I talked about Change Man and Endeavor. It is all about whatever tool works for you and your organization, and it's about using the right tool.
That's one of the, obviously one of the benefits of Planit, of course, is that we remain product agnostic and always will. So it's important that we have enough resources that are fully conversant with all tools so that we can provide best fit solutions. More of a complicated one, but it's the last one. The Toolchain you demonstrated works well for a simple application. How does it apply to more complex systems that may involve back-end legacy, web services, front-end web and mobile apps?
Yeah, so what we showed here is just a basic demonstration. It's an application that has database, it has static content, and it has middleware. I'm working with a client right now with an enterprise application. Our deployment tool is Ansible, and the deployment contains database changes. It contains pushing web services to Linux. It contains pushing some front-end PHP code to a Windows box, and even deploying a desktop application. So it's really about taking what we've demonstrated here, surrounding it with the right process, and then extrapolating out of that. So I've got a pretty complex deployment solution I'm building right now that goes out and talks to Linux boxes, it talks to Windows boxes, and services have to be started and stopped at the right time. But if you've got the right tool, it enables you to do that. It's pretty straightforward. So it's no matter how complex your application is, it's just a matter of selecting the right tool and then building out the orchestration.
We have a few more questions, but what I'd like to do is make sure that you are contacted collectively with the remaining questions and answers that are in the queue there. We know that your time is valuable. I'm not sure about you, but at DevOps, Planit DevOps, we can't sit still for an hour. We need to achieve results, so we're not going to ask you for an hour of your time today. We'd like to thank all of you who attended today's webinar. We hope that sharing the information and our insights in DevOps from the ground floor were of value. We're here to help, so just please reach out with further questions or inquiries. And in the meantime, thank you again for attending. Thank you from Planit, and please enjoy the rest of your day.